Picture this. London's chilly morning air. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. The royal guard standing motionless in flawless red and gold. Cameras clicking, children whispering, the quiet hum of history alive in every corner. Then, out of nowhere, a man with a megaphone steps forward. His voice booms, taunting, mocking, daring the guards to react. People gasp. Some laugh nervously. Others fall silent, sensing danger. Because if there's one thing the world knows, you do not provoke a royal guard. Not here. Not today. And what happened next stunned everyone watching. Before we jump in, if you love true royal moments, raw human lessons, and real stories that remind us why respect still matters, go ahead and tap like, hit subscribe, and share this with someone who loves royal history and emotional real-life lessons. All right. Let's step into the moment. The morning began with the kind of quiet that feels royal in itself. Soft footsteps on stone, distant carriage wheels, the gentle flutter of flags brushing cold London air. Buckingham Palace stood like a breath held in history, its gates gleaming, its walls whispering stories only time could hear. Tourists gathered not just for photos, but for a feeling, a moment, a brush with legacy. Mothers lifted children onto their hips, elderly couples held hands as if stepping inside a memory, and students clustered together, pointing toward the grand archways. Phones were lifted, some to record, some just to zoom in, hoping to catch a close glimpse of stoic faces beneath those tall bearskin caps. And there, in perfect formation, the royal guard stood like pillars carved from discipline itself. Still, silent, unbothered by winter's bite or the constant eyes studying them. Their red tunics looked brighter than the dawn, their stance sharper than any sword they carried. If respect had a shape, it stood right there, unmoving, unshaking, eternal. Among the crowd was a man who did not fit the usual mold of quiet fascination. Tall, brash, wrapped in a jacket far too loud in color and personality, he paced like someone waiting for spotlight. His megaphone hung from his wrist like a promise, or a threat. He smirked at families, rolled his shoulders as if preparing for battle, not a physical one, but a theatrical one, the kind only someone hungry for attention would stage. His name, whispered later by witnesses and scrawled across social media clips, was Mason. A traveler, sure, a tourist, technically, but mostly, a man who mistook disrespect for humor. Mason had a reputation among his circle, the guy who pushes limits, the self-proclaimed comedian who uploaded pranks for views and reactions. He didn't come for the history or the honor. He came for content. He looked at Buckingham Palace not with reverence but with plans. "Watch this go viral," he muttered to his friend filming on a phone, the red light blinking like mischief ready to burst. Little did he know, the day would not unfold as he imagined. The palace grounds felt heavy with ceremony. Somewhere nearby, a bell chimed. Guards breathed in perfect rhythm, even their blinks felt measured. Their training, 6 months of grueling drills, discipline carved into muscle memory, prepared them for moments exactly like this. Moments where dignity would be tested, where silence meant strength, where movement mattered more than words. Children waved tiny Union Jack flags. A young girl with wool mittens looked up at a guard and whispered to her mother, "Do they ever get tired?" Her mother smiled. "They do, sweetheart. But their duty is bigger than tired. Duty, honor, service. 3 things Mason never paused long enough to appreciate. Instead, he mistook stillness for weakness. With a dramatic inhale, he lifted the megaphone. It crackled to life, sharp and arrogant, cutting through the respectful hush like a knife in silk. A few heads turned. A father frowned. Someone muttered, "Not again. Why do people do this?" Mason grinned. He thought he was here to tet the guards. He didn't realize he was about to test himself. Before that moment, the day felt peaceful, almost sacred. Now tension began to gather like storm clouds. Even the pigeons near the statue paused, wings halfway spread as if sensing a shift. The guard nearest Mason didn't flinch, didn't blink. His jawline stayed hard, his eyes fixed ahead, his back impossibly straight. The kind of stillness that only comes from purpose. Deep, unwavering purpose. Behind that stillness, a history breathed. Ancient oaths whispered through generations. Men and women who served not for applause, but for country, legacy, and duty. Mason didn't see any of that. He only saw an opportunity.
Children waved tiny Union Jack flags. A young girl with little mittens looked up at a guard and whispered to her mother, "Do they ever get tired?" Her mother smiled. "They do, sweetheart, but their duty is bigger than tired. Duty, honor, service. 3 things Mason never paused long enough to appreciate. Instead, he mistook stillness for weakness. With a dramatic inhale, he lifted the megaphone. It crackled to life, sharp and arrogant, cutting through the respectful hush like a knife in silk. A few heads turned. A father frowned. Someone muttered, "Not again. Why do people do this?" Mason grinned. He thought he was here to test the guards. He didn't realize he was about to test himself. Before that moment, the day felt peaceful, almost sacred. Now tension began to gather like storm clouds. Even the pigeons near the statue paused, wings halfway spread, as if sensing a shift. The guard nearest Mason didn't flinch, didn't blink. His jawline stayed hard, his eyes fixed ahead, his back impossibly straight. The kind of stillness that only comes from purpose. Deep, unwavering purpose. Behind that stillness, a history breathed. Ancient oaths whispered through generations. Men and women who served not for applause, but for country, legacy, and duty. Mason didn't see any of that. He only saw an opportunity. He cleared his throat theatrically, the megaphone amplifying that too, as if the world needed to hear every breath. His friend steadied the camera. Their plan? Simple. Embarrass the guard. Get a reaction. Post. Gain followers. Repeat. But life is a funny way of humbling those who forget that respect is not old-fashioned. It's foundational. Nearby, an elderly man, Kane pressed against the ground, watched the scene unfold. His eyes narrowed slightly. Someone who had likely lived through eras where respect wasn't optional but instinctive. He whispered to the couple beside him, "I served once. Things like this, they sting more than you think." The woman beside him gave a sad nod, like she understood, like she saw the guard not as a uniform, but as a person, a protector, a human being holding centuries of tradition on his shoulders. The air grew still again, so still that even passing cars seemed quieter. It was the calm before something, a moment suspended. Even Kate and William weren't here. But the atmosphere felt like they could step out at any moment and glance toward the commotion, brows furrowed with quiet disappointment. Their world, after all, revolved around dignity, humility, and example, values mirrored by the guards who stood in silence. The guards' fingers flexed once. Subtle, almost invisible, but not to everyone. A woman gasped softly. She saw it. The tension, the awareness, the weight of what might come. Mason smirked wider. Confident, clueless. He lifted the megaphone fully to his lips. And somewhere in that crowd, a little boy whispered, "Mom, why does he look angry?" Mom didn't answer. She didn't need to, because every person in that moment felt the same thing. A shift, a tightening, a moment balancing between respect and chaos. The palace gates didn't move. The guards didn't speak. The world seemed to hold its breath. And that's when it all began. Mason's confidence grew with each step he took closer to the line of red-coated guards. His megaphone blared louder, bouncing off the palace walls, slicing to the chatter of curious tourists. "Hey, do you even smile under that hat?" he shouted, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Come on, loosen up. You're just statues anyway." Some people laughed nervously, unsure whether to join in or scold him. Others froze, feeling a strange tension in the air. There's a magnetic pull when tradition meets defiance, a sense that something vital is about to snap. The guard closest to him remained motionless. Not a twitch, not a blink out of rhythm. His eyes, hidden beneath the bearskin hat, were unwavering, almost hypnotic in their focus. To anyone else, The silence might have seemed eerie or even weak. But those who knew, those who understood discipline, recognized it as a force in itself. Mason misread it entirely. He thought the guard's stoicism was boredom or maybe fear. He had no idea that behind those perfectly still muscles lay years of training, moments of self-control honed to perfection. He didn't realize that a single misstep could break an unspoken code, and that this particular guard had witnessed decades of provocations without ever once flinching. He raised the megaphone again, testing its limits. "Oh, I get it. You're all robots, aren't you? No feelings. Maybe you're scared of me." He laughed too loudly, a sound that grated against the calm of the palace grounds. Children clutched their parents' hands tighter, sensing something was off. A woman near the front whispered, almost to herself, "Doesn't he know they are trained for this?" Indeed, the Royal Guard's training was legendary. Months of rigorous drills, both physical and mental, ensured that no provocation, no matter how ridiculous or insulting, would break their composure. Their silence was not emptiness. It was strategy. Every micro-expression, every shift of weight had meaning. And for the trained observer, it communicated one thing loud and clear: challenge me and you'll regret it. Mason, however, saw only stillness and interpreted it as an open invitation. He strutted closer, megaphone at full blast, waving his arms like a conductor orchestrating chaos. "Do you even like your job? Do you ever get tired of standing there like idiots?" Some tourists began to murmur warnings. He shouldn't, he's going too far. But Mason ignored them. To him, the world was a stage, the megaphone his sword, and the guards mere props in his performance. And then something shifted. The nearest guard's hand flexed slightly, so subtly that many would have missed it. But the crowd, suspiciously alert now, noticed a tension ripple through his body. It was the kind of tension that happens when a living monument, trained in perfection, acknowledges a challenge. The silence became heavier. People leaned in instinctively. They felt the weight of history pressing down in that frozen air. Mason, oblivious, pressed on. "Maybe you need me to show you how to have fun. Maybe I should." He never finished the sentence, because the guard finally moved, not with violence, not with anger, but with a precision that stunned everyone. He tilted his head slightly, a tiny adjustment, almost imperceptible, yet loaded with authority. The movement carried a message: "I see you, I hear you, and you've underestimated what you're dealing with." The crowd fell silent. The energy shifted from chaotic to electric. Even Mason paused, caught off guard by the simple power of calm command. He realized too late that mocking a royal guard was not a matter of bravado. It was a gamble, and the odds were never in civilians' favor. "Do you think this is a joke?" a woman muttered under her breath. "This is history standing right in front of you." Mason's friend filming began to feel the tension. He lowered the camera slightly, sensing the mood turning dangerous. Not physically, perhaps, but emotionally. The crowd's unease grew. Parents pulled children closer, and whispers spread like wildfire. "He's gone too far. Look at him. He doesn't even blink." And that was when the psychological reality of the Royal Guard hit home. They are trained to project authority without uttering a word, to enforce respect through presence alone. Every inch of their stance, every line of their uniform, every measured pause and breath communicates power. And power, when wielded correctly, doesn't need shouting. Mason's bluster began to falter. For the first time, he noticed the eyes beneath the bearskin, sharp and assessing. The crowd noticed it too, a subtle shift in attention, like a magnet drawing focus. The energy of the square felt contained, compressed into that single figure who had waited decades for moments like this. He tried again. "Come on, loosen up. You're just..." But words faltered under weightless authority. The guards didn't need to move to speak. Silence became louder than any megaphone. Mason could feel it pressing against him, heavy and undeniable. A young man next to him, probably about the same age, whispered, "Man, you're going to regret this." And the first cracks of doubt appeared in Mason's confident grin. He realized that the guards were not statues, not mindless robots, not props. They were living legacies, and he had stepped into a space governed by principles far older and stronger than his impulsive antics. The crowd, now fully engaged, began to murmur appreciation, not for Mason, but for the quiet dignity of the royal guard. Some even whispered to friends, "This is what discipline looks like, and no one is breaking it." The tension stretched longer than any moment before, like a string pulled tight, waiting for the inevitable snap. Mason's bravado faltered with every passing second. He could feel the eyes of the world upon him. And suddenly, what seemed like a harmless prank transformed into a public spectacle of reckoning. The lesson was clear. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Sometimes restraint carries more power than force. And sometimes mocking history and tradition brings an immediate, humbling clarity. It was in this atmosphere, electric, charged, yet respectful, that Mason first truly understood the weight of what he challenged. The calm before the storm lingered. The guards remained statuesque, almost unreadable, but the tension in the crowd revealed an unspoken truth. The balance had shifted. Mason's choices and the guards' measured response were about to create a moment that no one would forget. Because in London, where history walks alongside you, the world has a way of correcting those who forget their place. The tension was unbearable. Mason, with his megaphone still clutched tightly, could feel it pressing in from every side. The silent power of the royal guard, the watchful eyes of the crowd, the weight of centuries standing just beyond the palace gates. Every instinct screamed at him, "Back down." But his ego, fragile yet stubborn, refused. He took a step closer, the megaphone trembling slightly in his hand. "Are you scared?" he shouted, louder than before. The words bounced off the stone walls and reverberated through the onlookers. A few tourists gasped. Others instinctively pulled their children a step back. Somewhere in the distance, pigeons scattered, sensing the tension. And then it happened. The nearest guard, who had been perfectly still the entire time, finally acted, but not in the way anyone expected. There was no sudden lunge, no outburst of anger. Instead, he shifted his stance, just enough for Mason to notice. A subtle tightening of the jaw, a tilt of the head, a deliberate, almost imperceptible pause. The megaphone sound seemed to fade in that instant, as if the universe had muted Mason's voice for everyone to feel the full weight of the moment. Mason froze. His grin vanished. Confusion replaced confidence. The guard stepped forward, not aggressively, but with measured authority. Each footfall was precise, deliberate, like a metronome keeping time to an ancient rhythm. The crowd could hear the soft click of boots on stone, and the echo seemed louder than the megaphone itself. "Sir," the guard said finally, his voice calm but commanding, projecting an authority that didn't need volume. "This is a place of respect. Step back." The word "sir" hung in the air like a bell. It was not a threat, but a verdict. The calm certainty behind it was more powerful than any shout Mason could produce. He realized in that instant that he was not dealing with a man who could be intimidated. He was facing centuries of tradition embodied in one person. Mason's friend, filming the scene, could barely keep the camera steady. Even he understood that something extraordinary was happening. The crowd leaned in, collectively holding its breath. Some whispered among themselves, eyes wide. "He's done it. He's really done it," one woman murmured. Mason opened his mouth to respond, but words faltered. His carefully rehearsed jokes, his planned humiliation, had evaporated. The realization hit him like a cold wind. He had underestimated the royal guard. He had underestimated respect, discipline, and the invisible power of history itself. The guard's presence was magnetic. You could feel it without seeing it, an energy that commanded attention, demanded acknowledgement, and reminded every witness why these uniforms mattered. Mason tried to speak, to deflect, to joke, but the words caught in his throat. The megaphone felt suddenly heavy, awkward, unnecessary. Then, in a move that surprised everyone, including Mason, the guard slowly raised his hand, palm outward, in a gesture both firm and almost gentle. "Step back," he repeated, not shouted, not threatened, simply stated. Firm, deliberate, undeniable. The crowd exhaled collectively. The tension, taut as a drawn bow, began to release. Mason stepped back, the reality sinking in. For the first time, he saw himself clearly, not as a prankster, not as a comedian, but as someone exposed, humbled in front of history and authority. Somewhere a child whispered, "He's scared now." Yes, scared, but not in the way Mason expected. Not in the way fear comes from danger. This was the deep, humbling fear of being confronted by something greater than oneself. Something timeless, unyielding, and profoundly human. The guard didn't pursue further. He didn't mock, didn't escalate. He simply stood there, unwavering, a living monument to discipline and respect. The quiet strength radiating from him was louder than Mason's megaphone, more piercing than any taunt, and infinitely more commanding than the laughter Mason had sought. The crowd began to murmur, softly at first, then louder, impressed by the guard's composure. Phones were lowered, not because people stopped recording, but because words were inadequate. What unfolded before them was beyond entertainment. It was a lesson in human dignity, a reminder of values often overlooked in a world of noise. Mason's friend finally dropped the camera slightly, unable to capture the gravity of the moment fully. He realized that this was not a video for views. This was history, captured live in emotions and reactions. Mason, now fully aware of his mistake, tried to smile, but it was brittle, forced. He could feel the stares, not just from the guard, but from the crowd, from history itself. In a single moment, the world had shifted. His plan for ridicule had backfired completely. He muttered something under his breath, inaudible over the soft hum of the crowd, and stepped back further. The megaphone slipped from his grip. Some children laughed nervously. Some adults shook their heads. And then the unexpected happened. One of the younger guards, previously standing behind the lead, gave a subtle nod toward the crowd. Not at Mason, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement. A silent, almost invisible communication that reverence and respect were not just for the palace, but for everyone watching. Mason's humiliation was complete. The arrogance that had carried him this far had evaporated. He realized in those long, tense seconds that respect cannot be faked. Authority cannot be manufactured. And tradition is a force older than any prank, any megaphone, any viral stunt. The crowd exhaled fully now. Cameras clicked quietly, but the energy was no longer excitement. It was awe. People whispered to one another, commenting on what they had just witnessed. The lesson was clear. Sometimes restraint is more powerful than action. Sometimes silence can dominate the loudest noise. Mason, finally humbled, retrieved his megaphone and retreated. The moment had passed, but its impact lingered in every heartbeat around the palace. He had come seeking attention. He left with understanding, an understanding of limits, respect, and the quiet, overwhelming authority of the royal guard. And in that charged silence, the crowd realized something else. This wasn't just a personal lesson for Mason. It was a reminder for everyone present. A reminder that tradition, honor, and discipline still exist quietly, profoundly, and powerfully. That in a world filled with noise, some things, like dignity, still command attention without ever raising their voice. As Mason faded from the scene, whispers followed him. He'll never forget this day. And indeed he wouldn't. Not the fear, not the lesson, and certainly not the weight of standing before history and realizing, finally, how small one can feel when confronted with true authority. The royal guard returned to their unshakable stillness. Red tunics gleamed in the morning sun. The palace resumed its calm rhythm. And yet, the echoes of that confrontation lingered in every eye, every heart, every quiet mind that had witnessed it. History had spoken, not with swords, not with anger, but with calm, measured authority. And Mason had learned that lesson the hard way. The crowd slowly exhaled, as if collectively releasing the tension that had gripped the palace square for nearly an hour. Mason, still clutching his now silent megaphone, stepped backward, shoulders slumping, eyes downcast. The bravado that had carried him this far had evaporated, replaced by something far heavier, regret. People whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, some nodding in quiet admiration for the guard's composure. A few tourists even clapped softly, not at Mason, but at the display of discipline and dignity they had just witnessed. It was a rare lesson in humility, delivered without a single raised voice, a quiet demonstration of what true authority looks like. Mason finally spoke, his voice small, almost inaudible of the murmur of the crowd. I didn't think it'd. I didn't know. His words faltered under the weight of realization. He had thought this would be a moment of fun, a prank to share online. Instead, it had become a lesson in history, respect, and the quiet force of discipline. The lead guard remained stoic, his stance unchanged, eyes still fixed forward. But those paying attention could see a slight nod, a subtle acknowledgement that the lesson had been delivered. No punishment was necessary. No words of scorn were required. The dignity of restraint was enough to make Mason feel the enormity of his misstep. Around him, the crowd began to shift back into ordinary life, though many couldn't shake the gravity of what they had witnessed. Children tugged at parents' hands, asking questions about the guards, the palace, and why someone would act so disrespectfully. Parents answered carefully, realizing this wasn't just a story of a prank gone wrong. It was a teachable moment. You see, one father explained quietly to his daughter, sometimes people forget that some things deserve respect. Tradition, duty, those are stronger than any loud words. The girl nodded, eyes wide. Even stronger than a megaphone, she asked. Yes, even stronger than a megaphone, her father said, smiling gently. Mason's friend, still holding the camera, finally lowered it completely. The footage would likely go viral, but not in the way they had intended. It wouldn't be a laugh-filled stunt. It would be a story of humility, a lesson shared millions of times in clips and commentary. The public would see not the man's arrogance, but the quiet power of tradition and respect. And then, something unexpected happened. A palace aide appeared at the gates, approaching cautiously but with authority. He looked at Mason and, without anger, simply said, "Sir, I believe you understand now why our traditions are important. Please remember them in the future." Mason nodded, unable to speak, his face flushed with embarrassment. The words weren't a punishment. They were a reminder, a gentle correction delivered with a kind of grace he had never experienced in his reckless pursuit of attention. Meanwhile, the royal guard, having completed their demonstration of calm authority, slowly returned to formation. The morning sun caught the gold buttons of their tunics, casting tiny reflections across the square. For a brief moment, it felt as though time itself had paused, honoring the silent strength they represented. Mason finally turned to his friend. I get it now, he muttered. I really do. This wasn't a joke. Not even close. The friend nodded, equally humbled. Yeah, he said quietly. I think we just learned what respect really means. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but the impact lingered. People would remember the day a man underestimated the royal guard. They would tell stories of the stillness that commanded obedience, of the calm that spoke louder than any shout, and of the humility that overtook arrogance in a single, breathtaking moment. And in a quieter corner, a few palace staff and spectators speculated. What if William and Kate had been here to witness it? They would have likely exchanged a knowing glance, a subtle acknowledgement of the timeless lesson unfolding before them, a reminder that dignity and honor still matter, even in a world so obsessed with spectacle. Mason, now silent and reflective, finally pocketed the megaphone. It had lost all power over him. He no longer needed it. The lesson he had been given was louder, more enduring, and infinitely more humbling than any amplified voice could ever be. The royal guard remained behind him, a living reminder of discipline, tradition, and respect. No one needed to clap or cheer. Their presence alone commanded acknowledgement. And for Mason, that was enough. As the crowd fully dispersed, whispers turned into stories. Did you see that? One person said to another. The calm, the power, the lesson? Yes, replied the other. Some things you can't learn online. Some things you have to witness. By the time Mason and his friend left the palace square, the morning had transformed into a story that would travel far beyond the gates. Not a story of ridicule, but of transformation. Not a story of arrogance, but of realization. For Mason, the day had started with confidence and ended with clarity. He understood Perhaps for the first time, the weight of history, the power of discipline, and the quiet authority that demands respect without ever raising a hand. And in that moment, everyone watching realized profound truth. Respect is not given, it is earned. And the royal guard, steadfast in tradition and unwavering in presence, had just delivered one of the most memorable lessons London had seen in decades. Mason wouldn't forget, neither would the crowd. The lesson, humble, dignified, and quietly powerful, would linger, a testament to the authority that doesn't need to shout and to the value of understanding one's place in the presence of history. And perhaps, somewhere in the palace, even William and Kate would have nodded in approval, acknowledging that on that ordinary morning, extraordinary dignity had been on full display.